of government in the Rural Environmental Science and Analysis Services Division, and Mark thought I should perhaps give you a bit of background on that. So I work with Joanna Druitt, whom Mark mentioned, and Scott asked me to do this talk today, and RESAS fund quite a bit of natural, environmental, and agricultural research in Scotland through, for example, DHI, SIUC, the Morden, and the Rowell Institute in Aberdeen. We spend about 50 million a year on that type of research. That's where I work. And I'm also a member of the National Capital Group. So the National Capital Group comes from the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy, and is basically geared towards trying to make sense of natural capital within the context of Scottish policymaking on national environment. So the biodiversity strategy has these outcomes that are relevant for this. So healthy ecosystems to build Scotland's natural capital and increase our natural capital. Now, interestingly, the natural resources, it says, contribute to sustainable economic growth. So the way it's framed, it's very much about natural capital also supporting economic growth, which I find quite interesting in the context of biodiversity strategy. So our tasks are, for example, overseeing the development of the Natural Capital Asset Index. This is work by SNH, very ably undertaken by my colleague Paul Watkinson here, who's also a member of the National Capital Group. Then looking at new and innovative ideas to bring it all together, to manage, value, and use the environment within the context already of an ecosystems approach. And then, again, it's about integration. So this question is, how can natural capital, or this concept, or the application of natural capital concepts, improve integration of policies? In particular, it's about integrating government strategies for the National Capital Group. So we've got a challenge for biodiversity, the biodiversity strategy. And this second strategy that's relevant for us in Scotland, that is very much built on the idea of natural capital, is the land use strategy. So we're also trying within the group to see how natural capital is relevant to land use strategy, not only biodiversity strategy. But of course, within Scotland, there are quite a few other strategies that at least mention ecosystems, natural capital. So you can see that the idea of ecosystems, of an ecosystems approach, is actually quite widespread across government strategies. Now, the question is, and it's even now in the economic strategy, where it says we will protect and enhance our natural capital. Now, the question is really, I think, how far are these just warm words, and how far are we actually doing something about this, and how can natural capital help us do what we need to do? So really, I think for natural capital, what does it really mean? I think in the first instance, to my mind, it's about promoting the importance of the natural environment. And that's why I think, for example, that there's more of an emphasis now on natural capital rather than the ecosystems approach, because I think people do have a somehow more intuitive understanding of what natural capital might mean, as opposed to what ecosystem services are, what the ecosystems themselves are. So in a way, it's a way to communicate the idea of ecosystem services more easily to the wider public. Natural capital versus, or how does natural capital relate to an ecosystems approach? Now, I can see how it relates to an ecosystem service framework, in that natural capital underpins all the ecosystem services. And I think that's important to point out that definitions of natural capital, as far as I can have seen, always relate to ecosystem services, which in turn relate to the benefits that humans get. rather than natural assets in general, whether or not they create benefits for humans. And then I think there's an additional point about using natural capital is to try and make relevant the environment in terms of its economic benefit by valuing the outputs, by valuing the stock of natural capital that we have and showing how important it is. And I know that is not uncontroversial. And some people think it's the only way that people actually take note of what's happening in the environment. That may be. I leave it to you to judge whether it's a useful way of bringing to the fore the problems that the natural environment has. Now, as policy tool, okay, James, forget the trade-offs, but it's about identifying what we need to do. You know, where do we need to focus our efforts? And in terms of governance, it's accounting. I think that's an important point, that the natural capital approach, and through valuation you can actually start to account for things, and that's both in the public and the private sector, which is I think is an interesting way, if only very partial way, of trying to capture what's happening in the natural environment. And through a natural capital approach, you can also foster some kind of focus and more common objectives for different bodies that all have to work together to promote improvements in the environment. And that's not always easy, given that there are so many strategies that all have slightly different angles to the problem, and there's no clear prioritization necessarily between the objectives within them. So I just added this slide earlier on, because from what I've heard in the workshop so far, and I think there are common themes that actually also apply to this. So one thing is about complexity versus simplicity. You know, natural capital somehow tries to make something very complex into something very simple. That's why it's good as a communications tool. Now the question is simplicity, are you oversimplifying things? Can you actually capture the richness of nature in one simple concept like natural capital? So, you know, whenever you apply these concepts, whenever you apply tools, you have this trade-off between, you know, encapsulating something very complex in a simple indicator so that people actually can understand what you're talking about and can make a decision. Then the question is always, who actually benefits from this? I mean, the problem we have is the benefits are very diffuse. The people who suffer, or the entities who suffer, are non-voters for the most part. And who decides about this? This is actually spread across the whole population. The decision makers on the land are the land managers, the land owners. It's the public sector. It's us as households in terms of the type of pollution that we create. So it's a very complex decision environment. And the third point that came up again and again, I think, today, is context and scale. So at what level are you making a decision? You know, and the type of tool and type of information that you need is different for different contexts, on a national level, on a council level, on a local level. And Michael earlier gave the example of decisions on buying mobile, a house, or making decisions over nature. Now, and he said, well, it's easy to do the mobile, a bit more difficult to do the house thing, and most difficult to make decisions in the natural environment. That's true, but I think collectively we probably spend the most time on this and the least time on this. And that's I think that's because this is an easy problem. It's well defined. You know, you've got the funding. You know what you want. The house is more difficult. The decision context is different. You know what you want, but you don't always get it. You know what type of house you want, but it's not always there. I can go into a mobile shop, I can always get one. But I can't get the house necessarily, and there's no competition for the type of house that I want. So again, it's a different decision-making context. And the last one, again, is so difficult because the problem is unbounded, and there's so many different people who can make decisions on this, and who benefit, and on whom we impose costs. So the question really is how best to find a tool to explain the nature of the problem to the people that make the decisions to get the best outcomes. And I think natural capital is one way of doing this, one way of trying to encapsulate the problem. With the natural capital group's thoughts, we need to agree and integrate policy ambition. We need the tools and the means and mechanisms. But again, this is something that came up again and again earlier on today. So there's already a lot of things being done on natural capital, on the UK level, on the EU level, within the strategic research program that we fund. There's a work package on integrating decision making and a research deliverable on natural capital accounting and natural asset register, which I think is important, which goes beyond the idea of the natural capital as the stuff that we benefit from, to natural assets, the stuff that's out there that, like biodiversity, that might not have, or that is not easily linked to human benefit. And to identify within that asset register, which assets are at risk, understand the thresholds that we face, and make the link between asset functioning and ecosystem services that come from it. And so the question is, perhaps that's the question you were asking me, what's the role of ESCom in all of this? And I would hope that we can foster a way to make more sense of the natural capital concept in order to apply it in anger, in practice.